All right, now it's time to build a podcast summarization app, and we're also going to build a web interface for this application. In this project, we are again going to use Assembly AI's API that offers the chapterization, summarization features. And we are going to get the podcast from the Listen Notes API. So let's get into it. Here's what our app is going to look like once we're done with it. So we will get a episode ID from Listen Notes API. I will show you how to do that. And when we click this button, it will give us first the title of the podcast and an image, the name of the episode, and then we will be able to see different chapters and when they start in this episode. And if we click these expanders, we will be able to read a summary of the chapter of this episode. This is all quite exciting to start building a web front end for our application too. So let's start building it. So in this project, like in the previous ones, we are going to have a main script and we are going to have a supporting script, API communication, where we have all of our supporting functions that we want to use over and over again. We built this before, so this is the exact same one from the third project, the project that we did before. And we will only need to update this and change some things to start doing podcast summarization. So the first thing that I want to update here is that we will not actually need the upload endpoint anymore. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that one because the transcripts are going to be, the podcasts are going to be received from the Listen Notes API. So it's going to be somewhere on the internet. We will not download them to our own computer. So we can immediately tell Assembly AI, hey, here's the audio file, here is the address of the audio file that I want you to transcribe, and it will be able to do that. So there will be no download or upload needed. That's why I also don't need the upload function. Also the chunk size, not relevant anymore. All right, so that's good for now. And the next thing that we want to do is to set up the Listen Notes API communication. So we are going to use Assembly AI to create the summaries of the podcasts, and we will get these podcasts from Listen Notes. If you've never heard of it before, Listen Notes is basically a database of podcasts. I think nearly all of the podcasts. So you can search for any podcast. For example, one of my favorites is 99% Invisible. And you will be able to get all of its information plus the episodes. So you can search for episodes here if you would like to. What we're going to do with Listen Notes is that we are going to send it a episode ID, like specific episode ID that we will find on the platform itself. So let's say I want to get the latest episode of 99% Invisible. If I go to the episode page and go down to use API to fetch this episode, I will see a ID. So this is the ID of the specific ID of this episode. And using this ID, I will be able to get this episode and send it to Assembly AI. And this is exactly the ID that we need on our application. So to get that, first, of course, we need the Listen Notes endpoint. Listen Note has a bunch of different endpoints, but the one that we need is the episode endpoint to get the episode information. So I will just name this Listen Notes episode endpoint, and it is this one. And of course we also need the header again to authenticate ourselves, and in the header we're going to need to put a API key. So all you have to do is go to Listen Notes, create an account, and get an API key for yourself, and we are going to go and paste it here. And here, as you know, we are importing the API key for Assembly AI. Now I'm also going to import the API key for Listen Notes. And we are going to send it with our requests to Listen Notes. So I will call this the Listen Notes headers, and this is the Assembly AI headers. And for Listen Notes, this is named XListen API key. All right. The first thing that I want to do is to build a new function that is able to get the episode ID and give us the URL to the podcast's audio file. So I will call this one get episode audio URL. And it is going to get an episode ID. And we're going to send a GET request to Listen Notes. Let's build the URL first. The URL is going to consist of the listen notes episode endpoint and a dash plus the episode ID. And we are going to send a GET request to this URL. I will call the response we get response for now. And the last thing that we need, of course, is the headers for authentication, and that one is called listen notes headers. So after we do this, we should be able to get a URL for the episode ID, and the information is going to be sent as in a JSON format, so this way we'll be able to see it. So maybe let's try this at first and see that it works. So to do that, I am just going to again import from API communications, import everything. I'll just make this a simple Python script for now, and I'm going to call get episode audio URL. And I will use the episode ID that I found here. This one, to keep things simple, and as a result, we will print the response that we get from listen notes. So let's run this and see what happens. All right, this is really long, so maybe I will use a pretty print to make it more readable. So this pretty print here, and instead of this, just use pretty print. Okay, let's do it again. All right, that is slightly better. Let's see what kind of information we are working with. Nice, we get the audio URL here. This is the URL of the audio. Let's see where that takes us. Yeah, this is just the audio of this podcast. You can hear it.
Ferocity, that the Roman advance was halted.
Nice. All right, so this is exactly what we need, but if you want, you can also get some extra information about the podcast. If you want to display it in some way, we will definitely just display it. This is a description of the episode, whether there is explicit content or not, the image of this episode, and some extra information about the podcast, like Facebook handle, Google handle, etc. So you get a lot of information. So if you want to make your web application and your interface even more interesting, more interactive, you can of course include more of this in your application. So if we just return data audio from here, we will actually just return the audio URL. But you know, now that we have all this information, might as well extract some more of it. So some of the things that we can get is a thumbnail of this episode, name of the podcast, and title of this episode, for example, like we said, we will display here. So let's do that. This will be the audio URL. We will also get the episode thumbnail. We can get the podcast title. That will be in podcasts, and then the podcast specific information, and then we get the title. And lastly, episode title. I think it is just title, and we can just pass all of this information back. Episode thumbnail, episode title, and podcast title. So we don't really need to change much from the rest of the functions, for example, transcribe, poll, get transcription result that we already built beforehand. The only thing that we need to change is now we're not going to do sentiment analysis. We want to use auto chapters features of Assembly AI. So I am just going to rename these to auto chapters. This is just the name of a variable, so it is not that important. You can keep it the same, but for readability, it's probably better to change it to auto chapters. But here, in this variable, we need to change this name to auto chapters because we are sending this request to Assembly AI, and it needs to know that we want auto chapters. What else? We also just updated the name of the header, so it's not only headers now, it's Assembly AI headers. Same here. In the polling, we do not need to change anything. We are only asking if the transcription is done or not. Again, in get transcription result URL, we want to change it to auto chapters. One other thing that I want to change is, it's very small, but normally we were waiting for 30 seconds, but now I want to wait for 60 seconds because podcast episodes tend to be a little bit longer. So we want to wait a little bit longer in between asking Assembly AI if the transcription is ready or not. Well, this is another change, but the main work is going to happen in the save transcript function. So the main change we're going to need to do in save transcript function is that before we were uploading our audio to Assembly AI and then we were getting the result back. But instead this time we are going to only have a episode ID, and then we are going to get the URL from listen notes, and then we're going to pass that to Assembly AI to start the transcription. So what I want to do here is to, instead of URL and title, I will just give save transcript the episode ID, and then I will run the get episode audio URL from inside the save transcript. And as a result, what we're getting is audio URL, episode thumbnail, episode title, and podcast title. Again, we are not doing sentiment analysis, we are doing auto chapters, and we need to pass the audio URL to get transcription result URL. Get transcription result URL gets the audio URL as URL and auto chapters, but it is not defined. So, you know, this is what we want to do, so I'll just call it true here. The next thing that we want to do is to deal with the response that we get from Assembly AI. So let's first see what the response from Assembly AI looks like when we are doing auto chapters, and then let's deal with it. But let's fix some of the problems here. So I will not save it into a file for now. I can comment these out. This will be auto chapters. The main thing that I want to do is see what the result looks like, right? So I will pretty print the data. And the data is already in JSON format. Transcribe. Yes, it is. Yeah, so I will just show that. So I'm just going to comment these out for now, just so that, you know, we have an idea of what the response looks like. To run this, I will just pass the episode ID to save transcript. Oh, we're still printing this one, so I will actually stop printing the response from listen notes. And let's start it again. All right, so we got the results. Let's see what it looks like. It's a lot of information. Let's scroll to the top. What we wanted was the chapters, basically. So let's see what the chapter information includes. So as you can see, this is one chapter, and this is another chapter. So for each chapter, we have the starting point, and then we have the ending point, the gist of the chapter. So really quickly, what is this chapter about? We have a headline for this chapter and a summary. So in a couple of sentences, what is happening in this chapter? What is the presenter talking about? What we want to do is to show this information on our application, right? On our web interface. So that's why what we want right now is to extract this information from the response we get from Assembly AI and then save it somewhere, and then we can visualize it on our Streamlit application. So I will undo the commenting here, also here. So I will call this file with the episode ID. It will be episode id.txt. And as we always do, I'm just going to save the transcript. You know, we don't have to touch this so much, but I will start another file. and let's call this chapters file name. And this one will be episode ID plus, maybe let's call it like chapters.txt. All right, so the chapters will be another file, so I'm going to keep all the chapter information somewhere else. And in here, I'm going to write some of the information I got from Assembly AI, specifically the chapter information. And I'm also going to include some of the information I got from the Listen Notes API. One mistake here, I do not want it to be a text file. I want it to be a JSON file so that it will be easier to parse, easier to read later for me. The first thing that I want is the chapters, and I'm going to get that from the data variable. It's called chapters, so let's check. This section is called chapters. Yeah. So let's start it. I will say episode data. At first, let's include the chapters. Again, I will call it chapters. And then inside this episode data, what do I want? I want the episode thumbnail. I want the episode title. And I want the podcast title. So that I have all of this information in one place saved on my file system. I can just read it whenever I want and display it to the user. And finally dump that to the file, episode data. And I'll let the user know that the transcript is saved. This part we don't need anymore. And again, if there's an error, we will just say that there is an error. And we will return true. Now that we've got this far ready, up till now what we do is get the URL from based on the episode ID from Listen Notes, and then send it to this URL to Assembly AI, get audio chapters information, and then save it to a file. So let's see that this works well. And while it's running, we will start the Streamlit application. So I will just run this again. But in the main, we of course need to call save transcript. Oh, okay, we're already doing it. So I will just run the application, and let's also start building our Streamlit application now. So if you've never heard of Streamlit before, it is a really easy way to start building web interfaces for your application, specifically for Python. It's very simple to use. It has a very simple API. It's a very simple library. So what you have to do is you import Streamlit as SDE if you wanted to use it simply. And let's say if you want to, put a title in your application, all you need to do is SD title, and then you can show that it is a title. So I will run this separately to show you how it works. And to run Streamlit applications, you just need to say Streamlit run main.py. Streamlit is installed on your computer like any other Python library, so you just need to use pip. Say pip install Streamlit, and you will be good to go. Unless you make a mistake and call Streamlit with a capital S, which is not the case. It needs to be a lowercase s. So let's do that again. All right, so this is actually an application. The only thing we're showing right now is a title, and we know what we want it to look like is this. So I will start building the elements in this application. So the first thing that strikes us is that we have a sidebar. We have a title that says podcast summaries, and then we start showing the information from the information we got from the APIs that we've been using. So let's put a sidebar, or maybe let's fix the title first. We want to say podcast summaries. Title says podcast summaries. Or I can even say welcome to my application that creates podcast summaries. Let's see. Maybe that will be too long, but we'll see. And let's create the sidebar. It's quite simple. You call Streamlit sidebar.text input. Yeah. And then, you know, you can say, please input an episode ID. And I can also have a button at the end of the sidebar that says get podcast summary, maybe with an exclamation point too. So let's run it again. Okay, this is looking more like it. It says, welcome to my application that creates podcast summaries. I can put an episode ID here, and then I can say get podcast summary. So you see that it is running. It is running because I forgot to comment out this one. So it's actually running the whole application. I'll just stop it for now because we don't have any way of displaying whatever we get back from the APIs. So I'll stop this now. And now that we have the application looking more or less like what we want it to look like, let's wait for the chapter results to be printed on our file, and then we will see what it looks like, and then we can start parsing it and then showing it to the user on our Streamlit application. Okay, so the transcription is saved, our auto chapter creation is done. Let's take a look at what it looks like. We have the chapters section, we have the episode thumbnail, episode title, and podcast title. All good. In the chapters, we have chapter numbers, and inside each chapter, we have the summary, headline, gist, start, and end. So it looks good. Let's start showing this. The first thing that I want to show, of course, like we did in the beginning, like we showed in the beginning, is the name of the episode, or maybe name of the podcast plus the name of the episode, and then the episode thumbnail. So how I'm going to show that is again using Streamlit, and that is going to be the header for me, and I will include the podcast title, maybe with a dash in between, and the episode title. But as you can see, we do not have it yet. So first we need to open the file that includes these things. And the file that includes those things is the episode ID underscore chapters.json. So let's start that again. File name would be episode ID underscore chapters.json. And where do I get the episode ID? I get the episode ID from the text input. So the user is going to import an episode ID, and then I'm going to save it here in this variable, and that way I will have the file name. So then I just need to open this file. And let's just call it data. For example, I need to import JSON, of course. And load it into the variable data. So in this variable data, what do we have? We have the chapters. So first let's get the chapters, data chapters. And then what we want to get is the podcast title, and then the episode title. Let's change the names, episode title, and we also want the thumbnail. And what did we call the thumbnail? We can see here, episode thumbnail. All right, episode thumbnail. So we're already showing the podcast title and episode title, Streamlit header, and then we can show the image thumbnail with the Streamlit image function. And from this point on, the next thing that we want to show is the chapters, of course. One thing we can do is, for example, we can use a for loop. I could say for chap in chapters. You know, you can just say Streamlit write or just show the chap. But that's one way of doing it, but then you're going to have a lot of text one after another, and it's not really nice. What we want is, like in the original one I showed you at the beginning, we want expanders. So it's quite easy to create expanders with Streamlit. Again, you just say Streamlit expander, and then you write what kind of information you want to be in your expander. So as the title of the expander, I will write here what I want in the title, and whatever I want inside the expander, I'm going to write inside. So I do not need to use a Streamlit thing again, because this is going to be inside the expander. And inside the expander, what I want is the summary. So I think it was called summary. Let's just check again here in our JSON file. In chapters, we have summary. It's called summary, yes. So I want the summary to be in there. And as a title of the expander, I want there to be the gist of each chapter. So for each chapter, it's going to show me the expanders. For each chapter, there will be expanders, and the title of the expander will be the gist of this chapter. And inside the expander, we are going to have the summary of this chapter. So let's run this and see how it looks. But let's first make sure that everything works. So I have the title, and then I ask for a episode ID from the user. There is a button that starts this process, and for that to happen, I'll just call this button. So this information, this button variable has the information of whether this button has been pressed or not, and I only want this part to happen, this visualization, the display part to happen if the button has been pressed. So I'm going to wrap this all in a condition, so otherwise it's not going to happen. Yes, but right now, if someone presses the button, nothing really happens. So we also need to add an action to this button, and how we're going to do that is we're going to say on click. If this button is clicked, what we want to happen is the save transcript file to be run. So I'm going to call it here in the onClick argument. And we also have arguments, right? And here is how you pass arguments to your function that you call from your button. This is a tuple, that's why you write the variable or the argument that you're passing to the function on the first one, and the second one is empty. Now when the button is clicked, this one should run, and we should be able to see all the information on our application. So let's run it again and see what happens. Yeah, we need to run the Streamlight application this time. Streamlight run main.py. I'll close the old ones so we know the difference and which one is which. This is just the example from the beginning. All right. So we want to get a podcast, and we want to display it. I will get this one again. Let's get the podcast summary. And here it is. We have the title, welcome to my application that creates podcast summaries. Okay, maybe that's a bit too long. I will shorten it. The name of the podcast, name of the episode, number of the episode, also the missing middle. And here are my chapters. So apparently there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chapters Assembly AI's API was able to find. And in each chapter, we have the gist of the chapter as the title of the expander, and the chapter summary here. One last thing that I want to add is the start and end point of or just the start point of the chapter here, because I want to show like how long each chapter is maybe. So let's do that. So for that, I want to see in this JSON file how it looks. So the start looks like this. So these numbers might look a bit random to you, but basically they are milliseconds. So I want to turn it into minutes and seconds, and if applicable, hours, minutes, and seconds. And there is already a function that can do that. Here it is. We don't need to, work on it for a long time. Basically, you get the milliseconds, and when you get the milliseconds, you can get the seconds out of it, how many seconds there are, how many minutes there are, and how many hours there are. So basically, you're counting the hours, and everything that is on top of the hour is mentioned as a minute if it does not add up to an hour, and everything that does not add up to a minute is pointed out as seconds. And here is what we will return. So we'll say the start time is either hours, minutes, and seconds. And if there is no hours, we don't have to say 0 something something. So we just show minutes and then seconds. And how I'm going to show it is within the expander title. And I can, show it with a dash in between. I'll say get clean time. And in there, what I want is a chapter start. Let's see what it was. Just start. Okay. All right, let's run it one more time and then see what our application looks like. Awesome. Okay, this is our application. On the sidebar, we can input a episode ID that we get from listen notes. We can say get podcast summary. It will show a nice title of the podcast, title of the episode, show us a thumbnail of this episode. And for each chapter, we show the gist of the chapter, kind of like a headline, when this chapter started. And when you click the expander, when you expand it, you get the summary of this chapter. So this is what we set out to do and we achieved it. I hope you were able to follow along. Again, don't forget to go grab the code from the GitHub repository.